Now, shifting gears, totally, I found this other data in the UN Conference on Trade and Development on shipping data and container shipping. So I got a picture of a great big Chinese container ship here. And that's another way of looking at it, because actually the Belt and Road Initiative has an awful lot to do with shipping. I wasn't able to find overland cargo shipping, but I found seafaring shipping data. Actually, at Mount Royal, we have an incredible data set you could look into. For those of you who are in supply chain or interested in supply chain, the CN Analytics Lab that we have in Mount Royal has just incredible shipping data, real-time data. You can find out where ships are at any time in the world and all sorts of really cool things. And so it's important, right? And it's an important dimension of the rise of Asia. So let's look, and this tells an incredible story, right? Because G&I includes includes the service economy, which is massive, right? And includes all sorts of other dimensions of economic activity. But if we strip out, let's say we strip out all of the sort of physical aspects of trade, and only focus on physical trade, then container shipping is a really interesting way of understanding what's going on here, right? Stuff that's moving around the world, right? So we're not talking about FDI that's being done so that you can have local production and all that kind of stuff, but really just actual trade of stuff. Then this chart almost blows you away. So it's like there's China, and then there's everybody else. Now, I only have seen from 2010. It's too bad. Too bad my data doesn't go back further, because I'm sure a historical look would be really interesting, because I'm sure China would be almost nothing if we backed up to the 90s, right? But I only have the last 8 years. But certainly in the last 8 years, this data shows it's China, and then everybody else is nothing. Like, I mean, of course, the United States is higher than everyone else, but the United States is only relatively higher than the next sort of the next set of countries, right, and which are relatively higher to the next and the next, right, and there's a ranking order there, and then it just jumps up by it's in 2018 here it's 3 times, right? The Chinese container throughput is 3 times that of the United States. So that's what I'm measuring here. We're measuring TEU, 20-foot equivalent units of trade container ships, containers, right? So if you look back at that picture I put on the last slide, those actual containers, right? And how many of them per year, and this is in millions. So 225 million containers of stuff was shipped through Chinese ports, whereas less than 50 million container units were shipped through U.S. ports, right? So it's not a perfect piece of data, right? Because you could say, well, maybe the Asian ports are just receiving stuff, and then it's being, divided into smaller ships, so it'll be sent to different parts of Asia. And there's all kinds of things you could say about that, right? I don't want to don't make too much of this, only that it's massive, right? Only that the difference between the United States, the difference between China and the rest of the world is on a factor of, even a factor of 4 to the United States and a factor of 10 to most countries in terms of its trade in goods. So I want to sort of really let that sort of focus on us in terms of the importance of China and what it can do in Asia when it engages its partners, given its power in terms of shipping, right, in terms of trade. Okay, the next thing I want us to do is, and this will be kind of near the last thing I want us to do, is to think about FDI. And Franco Pan doesn't spend much time in his book even sort of thinking about what the difference between trade and FDI and all of those kinds of things are. And because he's a historian, and that's good. And so I wanted to add just a little bit more about FDI. And so I thought I'd start by sort of explaining a little bit of the concepts of FDI and then looking at what are the trends in FDI, because that's really important in understanding the future of economic power in regions. So let me just define foreign direct investment in a couple of slides here. So foreign direct investment, FDI, is made up of two components. One component we call the flow of FDI. And you see my picture here, I've got Canada in the middle. I'll use Canada as an example, right? So our major trading partners, major FDI investors, sorry, not major trading partners, our major FDI investors I have on the one side, and the inflow of FDI from our major FDI investor countries, the United States. The United States, I made all the flags the same, but the United States is sort of a dominant flag, should be a dominant flag in the Canadian context, right? And these are the origins of where direct investment, so actual large amounts of money from companies are taken and invested in the purchasing of assets, whether it's property or equipment or all of those kinds of things, to set up substantive operations in Canada, right? So we can think of an operation in Canada being a subsidiary of an American firm or a Dutch firm or a British firm or a Japanese firm or German firm or Chinese firm, right? And these are the FDI inflows into to Canada. And then on the other side are the FDI outflows, right? So money that Canadian companies take, very often mining companies that's our really big FDI outflow. But there's manufacturing, all kinds of companies, food companies that very large food companies, McCain's, that does a lot of foreign FDI. And the money that leaves Canada to other countries is our outflow. So inflow is money from companies in foreign countries that are headquartered there into Canada. Outflow is money from Canadian companies in Canada that's taken and invested in operations outside of Canada. Then we should know about the idea of stock. So stock is essentially the amount of FDI in total altogether right now in assets and properties and all of those kinds of things inside a country right now is the stock of FDI. And so it's basically an adding together of all of the net inflows of FDI over a period of time that exist right now. Like what we've been seeing before, over the past 35 years, we've seen a marked increase in both the flows and stocks of FDI in the world economy. So there's a lot of this going on. And much more so in the last 20 years than ever before has the ability to take assets, cash assets, and move them around the world. Just the liberalization of FDI over the last 20 years has been remarkable. And we may be seeing a little bit of pullback right now, a little bit of tension right in the West, but not much. And I think that's being really compensated for right now by what we see in going on in Asia. The average yearly outflow of FDI increased from 240 billion in 1990 to 1.6 trillion in 2017, right? So this is a remarkable increase, though there is a flattening these days. And I don't know what the COVID-19 is going to do to any of these charts, whether or not it's going to be a blip and then up we go. We would have to revisit this in 4 or 5 years. During the past few decades, the United States has been a favorite target of inflows, both from developed and developing economies. And that's sort of really interesting that many developing economies, the Chinese or maybe more recently developed countries, Koreans, have seen the United States as this really great place to bring their money and to invest. And there's all kinds of good reasons for that. I mean, look at the size of the U.S. economy, right? And its sophistication and its universities. And so I think that's a really interesting tension now that we can see from Frankopan's book, is that how does that affect the United States if there are other desirable places for FDI that are coming about in the world? So a few more graphs to visit, just like my last ones that I took from the UNCTA data. We're seeing absolutely an absolute upward trend until the last, like year or so. We've been seeing a sort of absolute consistent rise in FDI, except for during the U.S. Housing crisis, right, in 2007, 2008. There was a dip and then back up again. Are we seeing that right now, or is this a trend? But remember, this dip was prior to COVID. This is my last data is for 2018, so it's an important trend. But that dip that we're seeing, that's a dip in FDI stock in developed countries. But the FDI stock in developing countries, that hasn't seen a dip. So that'll be interesting, right? What is this trend going to look like in 4 years? If we project it out, right, if without proper data, we have no idea. But are we going to see a continued decrease in FDI stock in developed economies and in increase in developing economies? If we do, those lines could start to meet at some point, not in the distant future. And I think that's really supports some of what we're thinking about in Frank Pan's book. Now this chart's really interesting because look at the absolute dips we've seen in the last few years on FDI outflows from developed economies. So that the last few years have been characterized by companies in the most developed economies not taking more money out of their country and setting up shops. Maybe through mergers and acquisitions or through other sorts of greenfield investments and those kinds of things. I think that's really a very sort of interesting phenomena that's dropped quite a bit. I had read that, I've read that in a separate place, that the number of mergers and acquisitions from developed economies, companies in developed economies, has really fallen off a cliff. And so I think that's what these numbers really represent, is a decrease in companies going out and buying other companies. But we're certainly seeing a trend towards more and more and more outflow of FDI from developing economies. And a lot of that is China. Right? And I think that really hits home to Frank Pan's book. I think this is one of those slides that really, really shows the power of what Frank Pan is trying to describe in numbers. It'll be interesting to see in another 2 years, that line may cross, it may be crossed already, right? My last date is 2018. Those two lines may have just crossed. Where between the outflow of FDI from companies in developed countries versus outflow of FDI from countries in developing countries, mostly China. That means China is becoming a year-on-year more important player in investment around the world than many of the developed countries, right? Certainly we know, whether it's not all just China, but certainly we know now, developing countries are becoming a more significant player in world FDI than developed countries, right? It's a phenomena we didn't imagine occurring 20 years ago, or couldn't even imagine how it might occur 20 years ago. So that's really, really, really important. And so just a couple more slides. Just to pound some of this home. So now sources of FDI by region. So we did economies just now. So now let's look at it by regions. Now it clearly shows that Asia is the largest region for outflow of FDI, right? The source of a year-on-year source of FDI. What I did with this chart, though, I made it as a pie chart rather than a graph. And what I did is I just took the last 5 years and made them an average. So over the last 5 years, on average, Asia has been the largest source of FDI. Europe making 35% and North America 25%, right? Never get too sort of over the top on this data. Remember that North America is Canada and the United States, and Canada's a large player in FDI, but not the largest, right? And so the United States is still a major player in foreign FDI, but really interesting, right? That Asia countries put together make almost 40% now of outflow of FDI, and so that's really important. And then now let's just take it one step down and look at it by country, right? I just wanted to put this one in just to bring things home. The United States, the companies in the United States are still very much the largest players, and average in the last 5 years in FDI outflow, when it's only looked at in terms of country. But China is right below them. And then the Netherlands and Hong Kong below that. And that's really interesting. When you add China and Hong Kong, which from a Chinese perspective are very much related inside one country, two systems, that's a lot, right? The China-Hong Kong combination. And then Germany, and then we get into other players. But that's really sort of a powerful way of looking at what's going on there. And there's we are setting up this multipolar world. And that takes us back to our last book, and when we talked about multipolar world. But this is clearly showing the dominance of a multipolar world, right? We have, in terms of, because FDI is a really interesting indicator of power, because it's the amount of resources that companies are investing in assets and properties in other countries. And so that FDI creates an incredible amount of economic activity in the countries where it takes place, and influence and all of those kinds of things. We could have a whole lecture on FDI, which we don't have time for, but it's really a powerful indicator. And so we can see our polls here, right? We can see a U.S. poll. We can see a China-Hong Kong poll. And then if we look at the European players in this, they certainly make up a smaller but also a substantive pool of FDI outsource. So that brings us to the end of this lecture. So really what I wanted to do in this lecture, and I hope I accomplished, was to introduce the book and put some context around it, but not to go too deep into the book, because really the Frankopan book is a little bit out of my wheelhouse in terms of, talking in a lecture about. I'm not a historian, and he is. And I just found that when I was trying to do that, I actually had another version of this lecture that I just felt I was a bit too sophomoric, if you will. I just don't have the depth that he does. So let's just enjoy his book, right? Like let's just read it for what it is, and let's pull it out together. And what I wanted to do in this lecture was just contextualize what he had done and contextualize it in our course, and bring out some what I thought were the main themes that he has, and bring that together, and then to add on something I think that I could contribute as your professor more than he could as the author, is a data perspective, right? Is a more business economics perspective to what a historian brought to the table. So my hope is that when we put all of this together, I really hope this makes a powerful impact on you and your knowledge and understanding of the important role that Asia as an entire region, right, and the Asias, individually and together collectively, are going to have on the world over the next couple of decades, which will be the most important couple of decades for you, right? The next 2-3 decades is your life, right? Is your adult life time. So I certainly think that all this together has made a really interesting point that we're already in the Asia century, and that what China does and how it works with its neighbors is going to be incredibly important. And how we take advantage of this as Canadians in a multipolar world will certainly determine the kind of success and the kind of life that you're going to have and that your children are going to have, that you're going to set up for your children. And So I think that's yeah. So I think it was interesting, and I think this book is really, and I'm really looking forward to this sort of continued discussion of this, and then seeing what your essays look like, and your other projects look like in the course. Right then.